What if the past isn't missing, just misplaced? Picture a museum basement after closing time. The public galleries above are polished, bright, and confidently labeled. But below, in the air that smells faintly of paper and dust, shelves run into darkness. Cardboard boxes sit shoulder to shoulder like unmarked graves. Some are catalogued, some are not. And every now and then, a crate appears with a date stamped on the wood, a destination written in an old hand, and a silence around it that feels intentional. The story you're about to hear doesn't begin with a golden idol or a dramatic excavation. It begins with something quieter, a question that keeps returning across decades and continents. When new discoveries don't fit the story we've already agreed to tell about ourselves, what happens next? We like to imagine history as a straight line. Stones to bronze, bronze to iron, myths to maps. We like the comfort of a timeline that behaves, but real evidence rarely arrives in neat chapters. It arrives as fragments. A jar with an iron rod in sea. A hill shaped too precisely to feel accidental. An inscription that doesn't match the alphabet we expected. It arrives as a rumor in an old newspaper, a sealed chamber beneath a city, a restricted canyon wall no one can climb without permission. Most of the time, the process is ordinary. A find is logged, studied, argued over, and eventually placed into the slow machinery of consensus. That's the ideal. It's also why archaeology can be so moving. It is a discipline built on patience, humility, and the admission that we do not yet know. But the ideal has rivals: money, reputation, national identity, religious pressure, tourism, land rights, the fear of lending ammunition to the loudest voices rather than the most careful ones. Sometimes the rival is simply inertia, the human tendency to defend what we already believe, because rewriting the story feels like losing ground. And so, alongside the familiar romance of discovery, there's another rhythm: discovery, discomfort, containment. A newspaper runs a detailed account of something astonishing. Then the trail goes cold. An artifact is labeled unknown purpose and tucked away for later. A site becomes protected, which can mean preserved, yet can also mean inaccessible. A scholar delays publication, then retires, then speaks too late to be cross-examined. A curator hints at missing fragments, and the official record remains calm and complete, as if calm itself were proof. None of this requires a cartoon villain twirling a mustache under lamplight. Institutions don't need evil to become opaque. They only need priorities. They only need incentives. They only need the quiet confidence that they are the proper guardians of what the public can handle. Still, if you've ever held a photograph of someone you loved, you know the strange power of what survives. You know that memory is not simply truth. It's a story we keep revising as we age, as we grieve, as we learn. A family can quietly reframe a painful event until it sounds almost noble. A nation can do the same. A discipline can do the same. We do it often without noticing. So this is not a tale about secret cabals controlling history like a puppeteer. It's a tale about the fragile relationship between evidence and meaning, about how human beings, brilliant, earnest, flawed, build narratives to make sense of time, and how those narratives can harden into walls. Over the next 13 chapters, we'll follow a trail of contested discoveries and the people who stood near them. Workers who uncovered something under a city street, scientists whose data seemed to point the wrong way, Insiders who claimed they saw what the public was told did not exist. Some accounts will feel persuasive, some will remain uncertain. We'll treat them as what they are, testimonies, artifacts of human memory, shaped by fear and hope and the need to believe. And we'll keep returning to the same human question, one that doesn't accuse, but asks. Who owns the past? Is history a shared inheritance, open to revision whenever new light reaches it? Or is it a carefully managed story, protected from disruption, curated for stability? When a discovery threatens to unsettle our sense of origin, our sense of who we are, do we widen the story, or do we tighten the door? Tonight, imagine that basement again. Imagine the hush, the boxes, the labels, the gaps. Then ask yourself, if a single crate could change the narrative, would you want it opened? Or would you prefer the comfort of the story you already know? It started with a newspaper and a canyon that refuses to be fully known. In the spring of 1909, the Grand Canyon was still, in the American imagination, more frontier than park, more myth than managed landmark. Its shadows were not just shadows, but invitations, a place where distance swallowed sound, where rock held time the way a tree holds rings. And in that vast, indifferent cathedral of stone, a story appeared that sounded like something history might deny simply because it was too strange to carry. A front-page article described an explorer, his name spelled with the confident exactness of print, who had ventured into a remote stretch of canyon and found a hidden entrance. Not a shallow cave, but a passage leading into something engineered. Corridors, chambers, a citadel carved into the rock. The article described artifacts that seemed to belong to another world, symbols that resembled hieroglyphs, objects that evoked an old world far removed from the American Southwest, even the suggestion of mummified remains. Then came the detail that made the story feel heavier than folklore, an institution. The Smithsonian, the article claimed, had ties to the expedition, support, interest, a scientific stake. It was the kind of name that for many readers transformed a wild claim into something potentially serious. Because institutions, we tell ourselves, are anchors. They keep the imagination from drifting too far. But anchors can also pull things under. In the months and years that followed, the story didn't blossom into a scientific sensation. It didn't lead to a public excavation or a museum exhibit with dramatic lighting. It didn't become a chapter in textbooks or a documentary series narrated with certainty. Instead, it faded. The trail grew thin. Official denials took the place of further reporting. The canyon returned to its usual role, immense, spectacular, and safely categorized. And that's where the mystery really begins. Not in the claim itself, but in the way the claim evaporated. Because there are only so many ways a story disappears. Sometimes it disappears because it was never real. A paper prints a sensational account to sell copies, and time quietly corrects it. That happens. Human beings have always been drawn to the extraordinary, and journalism has always flirted with the boundary between wonder and verification. But sometimes a story disappears because it touches something that powerful people would rather not explain. Not necessarily because it proves a forbidden truth, but because it threatens to open a door to chaos, legal chaos, cultural chaos, political chaos, the kind of chaos that turns quiet agencies into defensive machines. The Grand Canyon is not just a landscape, it is a protected national symbol. It is also home to indigenous histories deeper than any tourist brochure can honor in a paragraph. A discovery that implied ancient transoceanic contact, true or not, would not simply reshape a timeline. It would collide with claims of ownership, identity, and narrative authority. It would force institutions to choose between curiosity and control. And so the canyon becomes a perfect stage for a modern kind of legend, the legend of the inaccessible place. There are areas you can't reach without permits, side canyons that are closed for protection, zones monitored not for mystery, officials insist, but for safety and preservation. In a landscape that large, that complex, you don't need a locked vault to hide something. You only need distance. You only need policy. You only need the natural truth that most people will never go there, and that those who do may not come back with anything a committee can agree to take seriously. Years later, the story would be revived by a different kind of voice, the insider who claims to have seen the back rooms, the shelves, the crates that the public never imagines. The kind of witness who says, in essence, I was there. I handled the inventory. I saw things that did not match the official denial. And yet testimony, like stone, can be shaped by time. Memory is not a camera. It's a storyteller. It makes meaning from fragments. It fills gaps. It defends itself against embarrassment and grief. That doesn't make it worthless. It makes it human. So how do we hold this story? Maybe the Egyptian label was a misunderstanding. Symbols that resembled what the writer expected, not what they were. Maybe the entire report was a mirage, born of a nation hungry for marvels. Or maybe something was found, something real, something complicated, and the fastest way to keep the peace was to keep quiet. In a canyon that deep, even truth can echo into distortion. But the question remains, carved like a narrow path along the rim. When institutions deny, are they protecting the public from falsehood or protecting themselves from uncertainty? And if the past is stranger than our maps, do we have the courage to redraw them? On a workbench, the object is small enough to hold in two hands. It doesn't glow. It doesn't hum. It isn't dramatic at first glance. It looks like something that might have fallen out of a ship's toolbox. Metal, weathered, ordinary. And yet the people who first studied it couldn't agree on what it was doing in the wrong century. In the early 20th century, among the scattered finds of Iraq, a curious artifact surfaced near the ruins south of Baghdad. It would later be nicknamed the Baghdad Battery, a name that carries both promise and provocation. The pieces were simple: a clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, traces that suggested it once held an acidic liquid. Reassembled, it resembled a crude galvanic cell, something capable, at least in principle, of producing a small electrical current. The implications were tantalizing. If the object had been used as a battery, then electricity, practical electricity, had been experimented with long before the textbooks said it was. Not lightning as myth, not static as curiosity, but a technology that suggested intention. And whenever the past hints at intention, our present becomes uneasy, because intention implies capability. Capability implies knowledge, and knowledge implies that human ingenuity has always been more evenly distributed across time than we like to admit. The battery story is not only about the jar, it's about the argument around the jar. One camp looks at the components and sees a plausible device. They point to experiments that show a measurable voltage can be produced if the jar is filled with something acidic. They imagine ancient artisans using it for electroplating, coating one metal with another in a way that seems almost magical if you believe the ancients lived entirely by candlelight and superstition. Another camp looks at the same pieces and sees something else entirely: a container, a scroll holder, a ritual object, a coincidence of materials that modern eyes are too eager to interpret through modern concepts. They ask the practical questions. Where are the wires? Where are the repeated examples? Where is the infrastructure that would make such a device part of a larger technological tradition? And hovering above both arguments is a quieter truth. Evidence is not meaning. Evidence is only an invitation to interpret. But interpretation is never neutral. If the battery was real technology, it complicates the neat story of progress. It suggests that innovation is not a staircase, but a series of sparks, some caught, some lost, some smothered by war or collapse, or the simple disappearance of skilled hands. It would remind us that knowledge can be fragile, that civilization is not guaranteed to remember what it once knew. And perhaps that is the deeper discomfort. The possibility that history isn't a march forward, but a cycle of building and forgetting. If you've ever watched an elder struggle to recall a name, you've seen the tragedy of forgetting at the level of a single mind. But societies forget too. Libraries burn, empires fall, languages vanish, skills become myths. And what's left behind, jars, rods, fragments, doesn't come with instructions. In modern museums, objects like this sit behind glass with labels that sound like careful shrugs. Possibly, thought to be, debated. A responsible curator avoids certainty when certainty isn't deserved. Yet there is also a public hunger for clean answers. People want history to speak in declarative sentences. And when history refuses, suspicion grows. It's easy, then, for a contested object to become a magnet, not only for genuine curiosity, but for narratives that turn ambiguity into accusation. The idea of suppressed technology is seductive because it turns confusion into a plot. It gives frustration a target. But most suppression, when it exists, is quieter than that. It looks like disinterest. It looks like underfunding. It looks like an academic career built on a different interpretation. It looks like a cautious institution that doesn't want to hang its credibility on a single strange jar. And yet, caution can become a kind of silence. Consider the human beings around the artifact, the excavators who lift it from soil, uncertain whether they're holding a breakthrough or a mundane container, the conservators who clean it, making choices about what to preserve, the scholars who publish careful papers and risk being dismissed as speculative, the museum administrators who worry that a sensational headline will overshadow years of responsible work. Each person has a reason. None of them need to be villains. And still, the result can feel like a lid closing, because a single object rarely changes history on its own. It requires a community willing to build a new story around it. Without that community, even revolutionary evidence becomes a curiosity, boxed, catalogued, quietly receding into the back rooms of consensus. So the battery remains a question, humming softly between possibilities. Was it a tool for plating and craft? Was it a container mistaken for a device? Or was it something else? Something we haven't imagined yet, because our own assumptions are as rigid as any clay jar. In the end, the artifact asks something more intimate than, did they have electricity? It asks, how often do we mistake the limits of our imagination for the limits of the past? And if a small voltage can be produced by accident, what larger voltages might history have contained, only to leak away into silence? There are places on Earth that feel older than the idea of borders. High in the Andes, the air thins until each breath becomes a small act of will. The sky looks closer, sharper, like it's been polished by altitude, and scattered across this immense plateau are stones that seem to defy not only gravity, but the casual confidence of modern explanation. The stones are enormous. Some weigh many tons. Some are cut with edges so tight you can slide a blade between them and feel it catch, not on a gap, but on precision. They fit together like a language written in rock, each block answering the next, interlocking without mortar, resisting time and earthquakes, with an engineering logic that modern builders still admire. Places like this, massive, exact, enduring, have a way of making people uneasy, not because they prove something supernatural, but because they force a humbler question: how? And whenever how is unanswered, who and when become contested ground. In the highlands near Lake Titicaca, ruins like Tiwanaku and the stonework at sites such as Pumapunku have long been caught in a tug-of-war between wonder and certainty. Archaeologists work to understand these places through stratigraphy, radiocarbon dates, stylistic comparisons, and the slow, careful accumulation of evidence. Their work is not dismissive of indigenous achievement, quite the opposite. It insists that complex engineering can and did flourish without needing outside saviors or mythic visitors. But outside academic circles, the stones attract different stories. They become too perfect, too heavy, too advanced. And into that space steps an old human habit. If we don't understand something, we assume it must not belong. Yet the deeper risk is not that we overestimate the past. It's that we underestimate it, especially when the past belongs to people we have historically refused to credit. Consider what it means to move a stone the size of a truck without cranes or steel cables. It means organization, labor, social cohesion, planning across seasons, knowledge of leverage, ramps, sleds, friction, and terrain. It means engineering not as a luxury, but as a collective intelligence shared by many hands. Those hands leave few signatures. Most builders do not carve their names into foundation stones. Their work is meant to outlive them. And so we stand centuries later with evidence of achievement and very little of the daily human story that produced it. The absence of that story becomes fertile soil for speculation. And then there's the question of access. Who gets to study these stones? Who gets to tell their story? And what gets emphasized when the story is told? In many parts of the world, archaeological sites sit at the intersection of scholarship and sovereignty. Governments regulate what can be excavated, what can be exported, what can be displayed. That regulation can protect heritage from looters. It can also become a gate, closing off inquiry to those outside a favored circle. You don't need a secret vault to control a narrative. You only need to decide which interpretations get funded, which ones get platformed, which discoveries get announced with fanfare, and which get quietly filed away. And because stonework is visually powerful, it becomes easy to weaponize in arguments about identity. Some groups insist the ruins prove ancient outsiders. Others insist they prove local genius. Both sides can become rigid, turning living communities into props in a debate that is more about modern pride than ancient reality. But the stones themselves don't argue. They endure. The most haunting moments at sites like these are often the smallest. A worn step where countless feet once passed. A doorway aligned with a celestial event, reminding you that someone was watching the sky and measuring time with patience. A broken corner that reveals a tool mark, human, imperfect, deeply familiar. Tool marks are a kind of whisper. They say someone stood here and worked. Someone sweated in this thin air. Someone made mistakes and corrected them. Someone understood stone the way a musician understands wood and string. In the stories that circulate about hidden histories, these sites are often presented as evidence that the official timeline must be wrong. But timelines are not laws of nature. They're models built from the best available data, revised as new data arrives. The most responsible scholars are not guarding a sacred dogma. They are defending the difference between evidence and desire. Still, the sense of something withheld persists, especially among locals who have seen outsiders arrive, extract knowledge and leave. For them, cover-up doesn't always mean a secret plot. It can mean a history written in a language they weren't invited to speak. So maybe the real mystery is not whether the stones are too advanced. Maybe the mystery is why we keep reaching for explanations that remove human beings from the center of their own achievements. Why do we want the past to belong to someone else? Why do we struggle to accept that intelligence, creativity, and technical mastery have always been part of the human story everywhere? Standing before those stones, the most honest feeling isn't suspicion, it's awe. Awe at what a community can build when it believes in something larger than a single lifetime. Awe at the way a civilization can speak across centuries without words. And then the question, quiet as the wind off the plateau. If these ruins were built by hands like ours, minds like ours, what else did the past accomplish that we've forgotten? And what does it mean that we're still trying in our own era to decide who deserves the credit for wonder? In the deserts of Egypt, there are doors that open only once. The sand is patient. It covers. It preserves. It erases footprints as if the world never passed through. And when archaeologists find a sealed chamber, an undisturbed tomb, a hidden shaft, a door walled shut for millennia, it feels like touching a moment that time forgot to ruin. In 1922, when Howard Carter peered into the tomb of Tutankhamun and saw wonderful things, the world watched history become spectacle, gold, masks, ritual objects, a king's story restored to the light. The discovery became a symbol of archaeology at its most cinematic, the past emerging intact, as if waiting for the right eyes. But for every chamber that becomes a headline, there are whispers of chambers that do not. Rumors cling to Egypt like sand, sealed passages in the Great Pyramid, hidden rooms beneath temples, artifacts that were catalogued and then vanished from public view. Some of these claims are rooted in real debates, ongoing discussions about new scanning technologies, about conservation ethics, about the tension between exploration and preservation. Others drift into the realm of myth, shaped by the world's obsession with ancient Egypt as a kind of spiritual mirror. And yet, beneath the myth, there's a grounded human truth. Egypt's antiquities are not just scientific data, they are national identity, they are economic lifeblood, they are sacred inheritance, and they are fragile. Every tunnel cut, every stone moved, every tourist's footstep carries a cost. So decisions get made behind closed doors, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for complicated ones. Imagine an archaeologist standing at a newly discovered doorway. On one side, the unknown. On the other, responsibility. If you open it, you may introduce humidity and bacteria that begin a slow destruction. You may destabilize the structure. You may unleash a media storm that draws looters and crowds. You may also, if you are unlucky, find something that complicates a narrative the world believes it already owns, because Egypt, more than many places, has been treated as a public dream. People project onto it mysteries, curses, cosmic secrets, promises of lost wisdom. Those projections create a strange pressure. They invite sensationalism. They can drown out the quieter, more beautiful truth that ancient Egypt was a human civilization full of labor, politics, devotion, conflict, artistry, and ordinary lives. When an institution withholds information, skeptics assume the worst, that something earth-shattering was found and hidden. But withholding can also be bureaucratic, legal, or ethical. An artifact might be under conservation. A site might be unsafe. A study might be incomplete. A government might restrict publication until proper protocols are met. Still, secrecy, whatever its motive, breeds stories. There is a particular kind of story that repeats across modern archaeology. The lost artifact story. An object is discovered. A photograph circulates. A description is recorded. Then later, the object is unavailable, misplaced, in storage, under review. The phrase "in storage" becomes a kind of magic word. It can mean genuine preservation. It can also mean the public's access has ended. Museums have warehouses full of items never displayed. This is not inherently suspicious. It's the normal consequence of limited space and infinite history. But in the public imagination, storage becomes the basement of the world's memory, the place where inconvenient evidence can be quietly kept. And so Egypt, with its global fame and centuries of imperial extraction, becomes the perfect setting for a modern anxiety that history is curated not only by evidence, but by power. There's another layer too, one that rarely makes it into the dramatic retellings. For much of modern history, Egypt's artifacts were removed, bought, stolen, traded, and displayed abroad. Entire rooms in Western museums are built from Egyptian tombs and temples. That legacy creates understandable defensiveness. If you've spent generations watching your heritage shipped away, you don't casually hand over new discoveries to international scrutiny. You insist on control. You insist on dignity. Control, however, can look like concealment to outsiders, and concealment can turn into a story that moves faster than any peer-reviewed paper. So what do we do with these whispers? We can hold two truths at once. First, Egypt's history is real, astonishing, and already profound without needing secret technologies or hidden alien libraries. The art, the engineering, the writing, the social complexity, these are the achievements of human beings who lived and died under the same sun we see today. Second, institutions, whether museums, governments, or academic circles, do shape what the public knows, when they know it, and how it is framed, sometimes out of care, sometimes out of caution, sometimes out of self-interest, often out of all three at once. The result is not always a grand cover-up. Often, it is a slow narrowing of the story, an unofficial decision about what belongs in the spotlight and what remains in shadow. In the desert, shadow is not merely absence. It is temperature. It is protection. It is a place where delicate things survive. But in human affairs, shadow can also be a form of control. So as we stand at the threshold of a sealed doorway, literal or metaphorical, we're left with a question that isn't about pyramids at all. How much of the past is hidden because it is dangerous to expose? And how much is hidden simply because the people who hold the keys have decided the world should see only what fits the rooms upstairs? It begins, oddly enough, with a map. Not the kind you fold in a glove compartment, but the kind etched into memory by rumor. A coastline that shouldn't exist. A continent drawn where the ocean now rolls. For generations, people have whispered about proof that ancient civilizations knew more than they should have, proof hiding in parchment, in ink, in the quiet authority of an old line traced across a page. One of the most famous of these rumors centers on a 16th century Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. His surviving map fragment, drawn in 1513, is real. It shows portions of the Atlantic world, coasts, islands, annotations, compiled from earlier sources. In itself, that's already remarkable, a reminder that maps are often mosaics, built from borrowed knowledge, rumors from sailors, older charts copied and recopied until their origins blur. But around this map, an additional story has gathered like fog. Some claim it depicts Antarctica, ice-free and accurately outlined, centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered. Others insist it shows coastlines with a precision impossible for the time. The conclusion, for those who want one, is obvious. Somebody had advanced knowledge. Somebody surveyed the world long before we admit. Somebody's history was erased. It's a seductive idea because it gives us a single artifact that appears to rewrite everything. A map is intimate. You can lean over it, trace its lines with a fingertip, feel the thrill of a secret hiding in plain sight. But maps are also treacherous witnesses. They distort, they exaggerate, they combine old and new. They reflect the biases and hopes of the people who drew them. A coastline might be shifted because of faulty measurements, copied errors, or the simple need to make a chart usable for navigation. An island might appear because a sailor swore he saw land in fog, and the cartographer decided the rumor was worth including. And then there is the most human part. We see what we are looking for. If you want the map to contain Antarctica, your eyes will find Antarctica. If you want it to contain only South America, your eyes will find that too. The artifact becomes a mirror, reflecting the interpreter's hunger. Still, the fascination persists, and it persists for a reason deeper than geography. We are haunted by the possibility that knowledge has been lost, truly lost, not merely forgotten, but erased by catastrophe. Floods, fire, war, plague, the slow collapse of trade routes and schools and libraries. We are haunted because we know it can happen. We have watched modern cities fall silent under storms. We have watched archives burn. We have watched languages die on the tongues of elders. So when a map seems too wise, it pokes that old fear. What if civilization has risen and fallen more than once? What if the world has had its bright eras and then its dark resets? And that's where the idea of cover-up slips in, not only as accusation, but as a way of giving shape to loss. If knowledge disappeared, perhaps someone took it. If the record is incomplete, perhaps someone tore out pages. But the truth is, pages tear easily on their own. Institutions can also shape how these artifacts are discussed. Academic caution can sound like dismissal to people outside the field. A skeptical paper can feel like an attempt to keep wonder at bay. Yet skepticism is not the enemy of awe. It is the discipline that keeps awe from becoming a trap. At the same time, institutions are made of people. People have reputations, careers, funding, gatekeepers. And when an idea threatens to draw crowds more than it draws evidence, the gate tends to close. This is where the map becomes more than a map. It becomes a case study in how knowledge is negotiated. On one side, the public yearning for mystery, for a past that feels larger than the official story, for the thrill of being initiated into something hidden. On the other, scholars insisting that extraordinary claims need extraordinary documentation, that you can't rebuild history on a single interpretation of a coastline, and between them, the artifact itself, silent, inked with lines that could be mistake or miracle. The most honest approach is to hold the map gently, not as a weapon, but as a question. What sources did Piri Reis use? How were they compiled? What parts of the map are accurate, and what parts reflect the normal distortions of early cartography? How do we separate the thrill of possibility from the patience of proof? And then, inevitably, the question becomes personal, because the map is not only about Antarctica, it's about how we handle ambiguity. When evidence is incomplete, we can either admit we don't know, or we can rush to fill the gap with a story that feels satisfying. The second option is almost always more emotionally rewarding. It turns uncertainty into certainty, and certainty into belonging. But the first option, the admission, opens something rarer. It opens humility. And humility is where real discovery often begins. So the map remains, not as a final answer, but as a compass for the listener's mind. How many lost histories are truly hidden? And how many are simply waiting for us to learn how to read the past without turning it into the story we already want? In the dim light of a gallery, a crystal skull can look like a confession. Clear quartz, polished into the shape of a human head. The cheekbones sharp, the jaw precise, the empty eye sockets catching reflections as if the object is looking back. People stand before it and feel something: wonder, discomfort, a tingle of the uncanny. It's hard not to. The human brain is built to recognize faces, to project meaning onto them, to hear stories in silence. And for decades, crystal skulls have carried a story heavier than their weight. They were said to be ancient, artifacts from Mesoamerican civilizations, carved with knowledge and skill beyond modern ability. Some stories wrapped them in prophecy, that they held messages, that they were keys, that they were evidence of lost wisdom. In museums and private collections, they were displayed like riddles from a vanished world. Then came the slow unspooling. Scientists examined tool marks. They looked at the way quartz had been cut and polished. They compared the skull's features to known Mesoamerican styles. They investigated provenance, the chain of ownership, the paperwork, the quiet gaps where a story should be. And in many cases, the conclusion pointed not to ancient temples, but to modern workshops, skulls likely crafted in the 19th or 20th century, shaped with techniques and abrasives unavailable to the civilizations they were supposed to represent. This is where the narrative flips. For believers, the shift can feel like a cover-up. Institutions embarrassed by what they once celebrated, now trying to bury the wonder. For skeptics, it becomes proof of the opposite. Not that history is suppressed, but that the public is easily seduced, and that museums, too, can be vulnerable to myth when myth arrives wrapped in prestige. But the deeper lesson isn't about whether crystal skulls are real or fake. It's about why we want them to be real. Archaeology is, at its heart, a discipline of humility. It asks us to accept that the past cannot always be recovered whole. It asks us to build cautious narratives from broken evidence. But the human heart often wants more than caution. It wants completion. It wants symbols. It wants an object that can stand in for an entire lost world and say in one glance, "Here is the secret." A crystal skull is perfect for that longing. It is instantly legible. It feels like a relic from a story, not from a landfill. And it blurs the line between artifact and icon, the line between what was and what we wish had been. The question of cover-up enters here in an unusual way, because sometimes the suppression is not of real history, but of embarrassment. Museums are trusted institutions. They trade in authority. When an institution displays an object that later appears inauthentic, it risks not only its reputation, but the public's faith in the careful work that museums do every day. So what happens? Often, there is a quiet relabeling, a shift in language. The skull remains on display, but the certainty dissolves. Ancient becomes attributed. Maya becomes Mesoamerican style. A confident story becomes a cautious paragraph. To some visitors, that caution feels like evasion. To others, it feels like honesty finally catching up. But to understand the emotional heat around objects like this, we have to acknowledge something uncomfortable. The marketplace of antiquities has always been tangled with desire. In the 19th century and beyond, European collectors craved exotic artifacts, and dealers learned to supply what collectors wanted. Sometimes the objects were real, looted from sites and smuggled through shadowy networks. Sometimes the objects were fabricated, created to satisfy demand. Sometimes they were a hybrid, a genuine fragment improved with additions to make it more marketable. In this world, authenticity is not just a scientific question. It is an economic one, a cultural one, a moral one, and the victims are often the cultures whose stories are being sold. When a fake object is celebrated as ancient, it can distort public understanding of real indigenous history. It can reinforce stereotypes. It can replace complex human civilizations with a fantasy version designed for outsiders' appetites. So the crystal skull becomes a kind of parable about how history is curated, not only by institutions, but by markets, myths, and the hunger to own a piece of the past. And yet, even as the scientific case against many skulls grows stronger, the skulls remain powerful. People still gather, still feel the pull, still tell the stories, because facts do not eliminate meaning. They simply redirect it. If a skull is modern, it is still an artifact, just not of the civilization it was claimed to represent. It becomes evidence of a different phenomenon: the modern world's fascination with ancient mystery, its willingness to blur lines, its complicated relationship with truth. It becomes a relic of our own era's imagination. And maybe that is the most unsettling twist. Sometimes the object doesn't reveal a hidden past. It reveals the hidden needs of the present. So as we leave the gallery, reflections fading in glass, we're left with a question that is less about quartz than about ourselves. When we encounter something beautiful and mysterious, do we ask first, is it true? Or do we ask, quietly, what do I need it to be? In the high desert of Peru, the earth is a canvas the size of a city. From the ground, you might miss it. A line in the sand, a shallow trench, a curve that looks like nothing more than wind's handwriting. But rise into the sky, and the meaning snaps into place. A hummingbird with wings outstretched, a spider poised in stillness, a monkey spiraling into a tail like a question mark. The Nazca Lines are among the most hypnotic creations of the ancient world, not because they are supernatural, but because they were made for a perspective their makers rarely possessed. The figures stretch across the desert as if meant to be seen from above, from a height that for most of human history belonged only to birds and clouds. That's the hook that pulls so many people toward mystery. Why would a civilization create art for the sky? The responsible answers are already intriguing. The lines may have been ceremonial pathways, walked by communities in rituals tied to water, fertility, and the rhythms of seasons. They may have served as astronomical markers or symbolic offerings, giant prayers etched into a land that receives almost no rain. The desert preserved them precisely because it is so dry, so still, so unwilling to erase. But the lines also attract a different narrative, one that thrives wherever evidence meets wonder. The idea that something else was watching, that the designs were meant to be seen by visitors from beyond, that the lines are runways, that the story of the past has been sanitized to keep humanity from realizing it was never alone. The trouble isn't that people feel awe. Awe is appropriate. The trouble is when awe demands an explanation that removes the makers from their own genius. Because the Nazca Lines are a reminder of something we often forget. Human beings have always been capable of imagining beyond their immediate viewpoint. You don't need to fly to design for the sky. You need planning. You need measurement. You need teams of people coordinating with stakes and ropes and careful geometry. You need a culture that believes in symbols large enough to warrant the labor. And labor is an underrated miracle, not in the sense of magic, but in the sense of devotion. Still, there is another layer to the Nazca story that feeds the modern feeling of something withheld, the question of what else is out there, undiscovered or deliberately unannounced. The desert is vast. Surveying it fully is slow, expensive, and often politically complicated. New lines have been found in recent decades using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and increasingly machine learning. Some are faint, some are damaged. Some are so large or so subtle that they blend into the landscape until the right technology reveals them. And here, cover-up can take a different form. It can be the quiet gap between discovery and disclosure. A team finds something, then waits, because they need time to verify, to document, to protect the site from vandals. They delay announcing it because publicity can be a threat as much as a celebration. Conservation becomes secrecy by necessity. But to the public, delay looks like concealment, especially in an era where information feels like a right, where every mystery is expected to be solved in a news cycle. There's also the economic reality. Tourist destinations have narratives. They have brands. A new discovery can be leveraged, controlled, packaged. Government agencies may gatekeep information not to hide truth, but to manage impact. And there is the darker reality of looting. Announce a newly discovered geoglyph too soon, and you may invite destruction. Announce it too late, and you may be accused of hiding it. Either way, the line between protection and control becomes hard to see. In the Nazca Desert, that tension is literal. The lines are fragile. A single vehicle track can scar them. A careless footstep can disrupt centuries of preservation. The desert holds memory, but it is not invincible. So the people who study and protect Nazca live in a constant negotiation, how to share wonder without sacrificing what makes wonder possible. Meanwhile, the myths persist because they are emotionally satisfying. They offer a grand narrative in which the lines are messages to cosmic outsiders. They give modern humans a starring role in an epic drama. They transform a difficult human achievement into a clue of something larger than ourselves. But there is something larger than ourselves already, and it doesn't require visitors from the stars. It is the capacity of human beings to create meaning at scale, to build beauty into land, to coordinate across generations, to turn geography into ritual. And perhaps the greatest mystery isn't who the lines were for, but what they meant to the people who made them. Were they walking prayers for rain? Maps of sacred space? Stories told with footsteps? When you stand in the Nazca Desert, the wind has a way of making you feel small. but not insignificant. The lines remind you that even in harsh landscapes, people have always found ways to speak to what they cannot control: weather, time, fate, death. So we end with an open question, as the sun sinks and the ground cools. If the lines were made to be seen from above, perhaps that, above, was not a spaceship at all. Perhaps it was the gods of weather and water. Or perhaps it was the future, us, arriving with machines that can finally see what ancient hands already knew was there. And if the past was speaking to the future, what else has it said that we haven't yet learned how to hear? It begins underwater, where certainty dissolves. Off the western coast of India, the sea is a living archive. Currents drag sand across the bottom like hands smoothing a sheet. Salt works its slow chemistry on anything that stays too long. And yet, beneath the surface, sonar can catch shapes that feel unnervingly deliberate, angles that look less like geology and more like intention. In the early 2000s, marine surveys in the Gulf of Cambay reported something that sounded almost impossible: submerged structures that resembled an ancient settlement, foundations, walls, patterns laid out in a way that suggested planning rather than accident. Alongside the claims came reports of recovered fragments, pottery, wood, bits of material pulled from a world that the sea had quietly claimed. Then came the dates, and the air changed. Some wood samples were said to point toward an era far older than mainstream timelines allowed for large, organized urban life in the region, older by thousands of years. If those dates reflected the age of the structures themselves, the implications would be profound. It would suggest complex human settlement in a period most people imagine as dominated by small bands and scattered camps. It would imply that the story of civilization, at least in that part of the world, needed a major rewrite. But underwater archaeology is a place where the past is exceptionally hard to read. A piece of wood can drift. It can be carried into a structure long after the structure was built. It can be older than the thing it sits beside, preserved like an orphaned clock. Pottery can shift. Sediment can bury and rebury. A straight line on sonar can be a ridge of rock playing tricks on the mind, hungry for symmetry. And so the discovery became a debate almost immediately. Some researchers urged caution. Don't declare a lost city until you've excavated carefully, until the site has been mapped in detail, until multiple independent lines of evidence converge. Others felt the evidence was strong enough to demand urgent investigation. After all, if a submerged settlement was real, the sea would not wait politely for academic consensus. It would continue to erode, to scatter, to silence. Plans were discussed. International collaboration was mentioned. The story appeared in public discourse with the kind of energy that tends to gather around anything that promises to change everything. Then, quietly, the momentum slowed. Funding became uncertain. Permissions became complicated. The urgent follow-up that many expected did not unfold at the pace the headlines suggested. The discovery drifted toward the margins, becoming an occasional reference rather than a sustained scientific campaign. This is where the idea of suppression finds its footing, not necessarily as a dramatic act of denial, but as a slow narrowing of attention. Because when archaeology becomes entangled with modern identity, the stakes rise. A discovery that pushes civilization's timeline back can be embraced as cultural pride. It can also become political fuel. It can be used to support ideologies that prefer mythic grandeur over careful complexity. It can be weaponized in arguments about who belongs, who came first, who has rightful claim. In such an environment, officials may fear that publishing uncertain findings will inflame narratives they cannot control. And there is another reality: international scrutiny. Extraordinary claims attract global attention, and global attention brings both prestige and pressure. If the evidence later proves weaker than hoped, reputations suffer. Institutions become cautious. Agencies that manage heritage may decide it's safer to wait, safer to say less, safer to protect the existing story until proof is unshakable. But waiting has a cost. Underwater sites are not like dry caves or sealed tombs. They are exposed to constant motion. Every season of currents is a chapter lost, a wall softened, an artifact rolled away. To delay investigation can be, unintentionally, to participate in erasure. So which is the greater responsibility: to protect the public from premature conclusions, or to protect the evidence from the ocean's steady appetite? The people at the center of this story, scientists, divers, officials, would each answer differently. Many are driven by sincere motives: preservation, accuracy, restraint. Yet restraint can still feel like a door closing, especially to those who believe the dates were telling the truth. And that is the strange emotional tension of the Gulf. A discovery that, if real, asks us to expand our imagination of early human capability, and if uncertain, still asks us to confront how easily narratives become guarded when they brush against politics. Because perhaps the most important lesson isn't whether there is a city under the waves. Perhaps it's how quickly we learn that the past is not just evidence. It is a resource. It is power. It is identity. And when something underwater threatens to shift those currents, the pressure to keep it submerged can be almost irresistible. So the sea keeps moving, and we are left at the shoreline with a question that feels both scientific and deeply human. If the past is fragile and truth is slow, what do we owe the submerged stories before they are gone? And when evidence rises from the deep, do we greet it with curiosity or with fear of what it might force us to become? It begins with a body in the ice, so quiet it feels like a spell. High in the mountains, where the air is thin and the wind cuts like wire, death can become preservation. A traveler falls, a storm arrives, snow covers what remains, and the glacier, indifferent and steady, locks a human life into cold storage for centuries, sometimes millennia, holding skin, clothing, tools, holding the intimate evidence of how someone once moved through the world. When a frozen body emerges, it is not just a discovery. It is a collision between eras. The most famous modern example is a man found in the Alps, exposed by melting ice. His existence became a bridge to a distant time. Tattoos, a copper axe, clothing stitched with skill. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a myth. He was an ordinary human being whose final moments were suddenly available for study. And with him came a reminder. The past is not abstract. It has fingerprints. But there are other icy stories too. Whispers of anomalous finds, reports of bodies or artifacts in places that make scientists uneasy, claims that a discovery was made and then disappeared into institutional silence. These are the tales that gather around glaciers the way fog gathers around mountain ridges, hard to pin down, easy to feel. Why do these stories persist? Because ice is a kind of time machine that doesn't require a theory. It gives us the illusion of direct contact, unmediated by crumbling stone or rotted wood. When we look at a preserved face, we are not looking at a symbol. We are looking at someone. And someone can complicate a timeline faster than a broken pot ever could. In some cases, what complicates the story is not age, but context. A tool made from the wrong material. A piece of clothing that suggests a trade route we didn't expect. A wound pattern that hints at violence or conflict. Or simply the existence of a human being in a location where we assumed humans rarely traveled. Each anomaly asks a question, not a conspiratorial one, but a sober one. What else did people do that we haven't imagined? Now add modern reality. Glaciers are melting. In our lifetime, ice that held history for thousands of years is retreating at a speed that feels like loss in real time. Each summer can reveal new artifacts, wooden tools, leather, woven textiles, animal remains, human traces. This is a windfall for archaeology and also a tragedy, because once exposed, organic objects decay quickly. Sunlight and microbes begin the work the ice prevented. Preservation becomes a race, and races change behavior. When an artifact appears, teams must act fast. The chain of custody matters. The documentation matters. The conservation facilities matter. And because these finds are rare and high-profile, governments and institutions may restrict information until proper protocols are met. They may announce only what they can verify, while other details remain confidential until analysis is complete. Again, the same pattern. Protection can look like secrecy, but there is another pattern too, one tied to reputation. If a frozen find suggests something that challenges a settled narrative, institutions may hesitate, not because they are hiding a revolution, but because they know how easily misinformation spreads. A single misinterpreted result can become a headline, then a permanent myth. No serious scientist wants their work to become a meme. And yet, hesitation has consequences. Public trust frays. People imagine suppression. Conspiracy narratives bloom in the silence, so the cycle repeats. Caution breeds suspicion. Suspicion pressures caution. What's most haunting, though, is how these bodies change the emotional temperature of history. A ruin is impressive, but it is distant. A preserved body is intimate. It forces empathy. It forces the imagination to stop treating the past like a stage set and start treating it like a populated world. You see the weave of clothing and realize someone learned that craft from someone else. You see tool marks and realize someone practiced. You see a wound and realize someone suffered, feared, ran, fought, bled. You realize that the human story has always included tenderness and violence, endurance and collapse. And that realization can be unsettling, because it narrows the gap between then and now. It suggests that our modern certainties are not as permanent as we pretend. So when people hear rumors of ice finds being taken away, hidden, not disclosed, they are responding not only to the politics of archaeology, but to a deeper fear that the past is slipping away and being controlled at the same time. That we are losing memory twice, first to time and then to gatekeeping. We don't know, in every case, what is true in those rumors. Many are likely exaggerations. Some may be misunderstandings. A few may contain a kernel of reality, a find that was handled quietly to protect it, to verify it, to manage the narrative responsibly. But the emotional core remains. Ice gives and ice takes. It gives us a person. It takes away our comfortable distance. As the glacier melts under a warming sun, the mountain offers us fragments of lives that never expected to be seen again. And we are left with a final question carried on cold wind. If the Earth is releasing its memories faster than we can learn from them, what will we choose to save? And will we have the humility to let those ancient faces change the stories we tell about who we have always been. In a library, the most dangerous thing is not fire, it's silence. A book can burn quickly, yes, but a book can also be erased without flame. By being mislabeled, misplaced, locked away, or simply never translated, a text can survive physically while disappearing culturally as if it were written in invisible ink. And when the subject is ancient history, the difference between survival and disappearance can come down to one gatekeeper, one shelf, one decision not to publish. In the early 20th century, in the deserts of Egypt, a set of papyrus fragments surfaced that would become both famous and strangely unresolved, the so-called Tully papyrus. The story goes like this. A Vatican museum director acquired or transcribed a text that described unusual phenomena in the sky during the reign of an Egyptian pharaoh. Circles of fire, luminous objects, a kind of aerial event that reads, to modernize, like an ancient report of something extraordinary. But the papyrus itself is elusive. Most people have encountered it not as an original artifact, but as a story about a story, transcriptions, translations, secondary references. The original document's location and authenticity have been debated. Scholars argue over provenance, over the accuracy of the translation, over whether the text has been embellished by modern fascination. And here we arrive at a different kind of cover-up narrative, one that thrives wherever the primary evidence is hard to access. When you can't see the original, you can't measure its age, analyze its ink, examine its fibers, or evaluate the chain of custody with confidence. The story becomes vulnerable to distortion. It becomes a hall of mirrors. Each retelling adds polish to a myth or skepticism to a rumor, depending on the teller's needs. Why does such a text matter? Not because it would prove visitors from the sky. That leap is too easy, too eager. It matters because it reveals the human desire to find continuity between ancient wonder and modern mystery. It reminds us that people in every era have looked upward and seen things they could not explain. Comets, meteors, atmospheric phenomena, rare light events. They wrote about them with the language they had, language that can sound uncanny when separated from its context. And yet the stubborn question remains. What if an ancient text truly describes something outside the ordinary pattern? The responsible approach is not to declare it evidence of the impossible. The responsible approach is to ask for the material, to ask for verification, to ask for transparency. But transparency is difficult when institutions hold fragile objects under conditions the public cannot easily inspect. Libraries and museums are not simply warehouses, they are guardians. And guardians make choices. What to display, what to conserve, what to restrict, what to digitize, what to prioritize for scholarship. Most of these choices are not sinister. They are practical. They are shaped by budgets, staffing, politics, and risk. Still, a practical choice can feel like a locked door, especially when the subject touches the most combustible parts of human imagination. The skies, the unknown, the idea that the story of human experience includes encounters we have forgotten or refused to record properly. So the Tully Papyrus story becomes emblematic of a broader phenomenon, the missing original. In many controversial historical claims, the pattern repeats. An artifact is said to exist. A transcription circulates. The original is inaccessible. Skeptics point out the obvious weakness. Believers point to the denial as proof of suppression. Both sides become trapped in a loop where the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence or evidence of conspiracy, depending on which narrative you already inhabit. And what gets lost in the loop is the quieter, more human point. Knowledge is always mediated. We trust institutions because we must. We cannot personally verify every artifact, every text, every date. We outsource trust to systems. Those systems, in turn, are human. They contain mistakes, biases, competing incentives. Sometimes they protect truth. Sometimes they protect themselves. Often, they do both. If you've ever tried to retrieve a family story, asking older relatives about something that happened before you were born, you know how fragile this process is. One person refuses to talk. Another misremembers. Another tells the story in a way that makes them look better. The event remains real, but its shape becomes uncertain. Multiply that by centuries, by politics, by empires, and you begin to see why ancient texts can be both powerful and treacherous. So what do we do with a story like this? We hold it as a question about method, not a trophy for belief. Where is the original? What is the chain of custody? Are there independent confirmations? Are there other texts describing similar phenomena in similar language? Could the description refer to a natural event, interpreted through a cultural lens? Could it be a later addition? Could it be a modern fabrication? These questions are not meant to crush wonder. They are meant to protect wonder from becoming a lie. Because there is nothing more haunting than believing in a story that collapses under scrutiny. It leaves you not only disappointed, but suspicious of everything else that might be true. And there is nothing more beautiful than a verified text that genuinely surprises us, because then the surprise belongs to reality, not to our hunger. So we end this chapter not with an answer, but with a principle. The past deserves both imagination and rigor. And the question that lingers, like a whisper between shelves, is this: if a text could change what we think we know, do we have the courage to demand proof without demanding certainty? And can we learn to live with mysteries that remain, without turning them into weapons against truth itself? In the jungles, the air itself feels like a curtain. Green folds over green. Vines stitch the canopy into a ceiling. The ground is soft with rot and rebirth, and sound travels strangely. Bird calls snapping like twigs, distant water muttering in the dark. In places like this, you can stand a few yards from a massive ruin and never know it's there. The forest doesn't just hide, it reclaims. For much of modern history, that reclamation shaped what we believed about ancient civilizations. If you can't see a city, you assume it never existed. If you can't walk its streets, you imagine small villages instead. The absence becomes a story of absence. Then the technology changed. In recent years, researchers began using Lidar, laser scanning from aircraft, to map landscapes beneath vegetation. The results were startling. In parts of Central America, Lidar revealed networks of structures, platforms, roads, terraces, canals, dense patterns that implied far larger populations and far more sophisticated land management than many outsiders expected. It wasn't magic, it was measurement. But the effect felt like revelation. Suddenly, the jungle wasn't an empty wilderness dotted with a few temples. It was a crowded, engineered world. Cities connected by causeways, hills reshaped into farmland, water controlled with intelligent design. The ancient people weren't merely surviving the forest, they were collaborating with it. And that revelation carried a quiet accusation, not against any one person, but against a long habit of underestimation. Because if those cities existed, why were they so long misunderstood? Part of the answer is simple. The jungle is effective at hiding, but the other part is cultural. For centuries, Indigenous complexity was minimized or ignored by outsiders who couldn't imagine that civilizations they didn't build could have been vast, organized, and resilient. In some narratives, the discovery of ruins by Europeans was treated as if it were the first moment those ruins mattered, despite the fact that local communities often knew they were there all along. So when Lidar reshapes the story, it doesn't just change archaeology, it changes pride. It changes politics. It changes the way a society sees the people who live on that land today. And wherever pride and politics meet, the idea of a cover-up enters. Not always as a deliberate act, but as a pattern. What gets emphasized and what gets ignored. For decades, there were scholars who argued for large populations and complex systems in the ancient Americas. Some were taken seriously. Others were dismissed, not always fairly. Scientific debates are supposed to be about evidence, but evidence is interpreted by human beings, and human beings don't enter a debate as blank slates. They carry assumptions. They carry professional incentives. They carry the weight of what their mentors taught them. They carry the fear of being the person who overreached. So a cautious field can lag behind reality. When a new tool like Lidar arrives, it doesn't only reveal new data, it reveals the shape of old blind spots. It can make earlier skepticism look like suppression, even when it was simply the normal conservatism of science. But there is also the practical secrecy, the kind that is less about narrative control and more about survival. When Lidar identifies a new site, announcing its location can invite looters. In regions where economic desperation meets black market demand, a single revealed coordinate can become a death sentence for a buried city. Treasure hunters arrive with shovels and chainsaws. Ritual objects become commodities. Human remains are disturbed. Context is destroyed. And with context, meaning is lost. So archaeologists sometimes keep locations confidential. Governments sometimes restrict data. Researchers sometimes publish findings without detailed maps. Again, protection can look like concealment. And in the age of instant information, concealment breeds suspicion. This is the modern paradox of discovery. The more we can see, the more we must hide to preserve what we've found. And there is another paradox too, more unsettling. When Lidar shows that ancient cities were vast, it implies that modern development, roads, logging, agriculture, mining, may be destroying heritage that no one even knew was there. Land rights disputes can ignite. Environmental battles can intensify. The past becomes a legal argument. In that context, keeping quiet can also be strategic. A corporation might prefer that a heritage site remain unknown. A local government might prefer not to complicate an infrastructure project. A powerful landowner might prefer not to invite scrutiny. The jungle becomes not just a curtain of leaves, but a curtain of interests. None of this requires a single, unified conspiracy. It requires only a predictable truth. People protect what benefits them. So the question becomes not whether the ancient cities existed, they did, but how their existence changes the moral landscape of the present. If the land holds evidence of complex, indigenous civilization, what does that mean for how we treat indigenous communities today? If ancient people managed ecosystems wisely, what does that imply about modern narratives that frame forests as unused until modern industry arrives? If the past was crowded with life and intelligence, what does that demand of our respect? In the end, Lidar offers a kind of metaphor for our era. We have tools now that can see through surfaces. We can reveal the hidden structures beneath the stories we inherited. But seeing is only the first step. The harder step is letting what we see change us. So as the aircraft passes overhead, as invisible pulses map the ground beneath the canopy, we're left with a question as soft as jungle rain. When evidence finally becomes undeniable, do institutions open their stories, or do they simply find new ways to keep the old narrative intact by moving the debate from "did it exist" to "what are we willing to admit it means"? In a quiet office, someone closes a drawer. It's a small motion, a hand on a metal handle, a soft click, the sound of paper settling. If you didn't know what you were listening for, you'd miss it. But there are people who swear they have heard that click in the story of archaeology again and again. The moment a discovery becomes sensitive, the moment a file becomes restricted, the moment a question is delayed long enough to lose its urgency. This chapter is not about one artifact or one ruin. It's about the pattern that binds the others together. Because across the stories we've walked through, canyons, deserts, seas, jungles, the same tension keeps returning. Discovery is not only a scientific event, it is a human event. And human events are shaped by fear, ambition, pride, and the desire to control uncertainty. Insiders, whistleblowers, and frustrated researchers often describe a familiar landscape behind the public exhibits. Storage rooms stacked with unstudied objects, private collections donated with conditions, boxes labeled in vague language, paperwork that travels slowly, committees that decide what gets prioritized. They describe how a find can be real and still vanish from the cultural conversation simply because it never becomes a headline. Sometimes it vanishes because it's mundane. Most artifacts are. A civilization is mostly broken pottery and ordinary tools, the quiet evidence of daily life. But sometimes, they say, it vanishes because it's inconvenient. Inconvenient can mean many things. It can mean the object is hard to date and therefore easy to argue about. It can mean it challenges a cherished interpretation. It can mean it would require a museum to admit earlier mistakes. It can mean it complicates a national narrative. It can mean it threatens the funding stream of a major project. It can mean it will ignite public obsession that overwhelms careful scholarship. It can mean it will be weaponized by people with political agendas. Inconvenient doesn't always mean world-changing. Sometimes it simply means messy. And institutions dislike mess. Institutions are built to produce stability. Think about how knowledge becomes official. It doesn't become official the moment it is discovered. It becomes official when it is replicated, reviewed, agreed upon, and woven into a broader framework. That process is slow for good reasons. It protects us from being fooled by coincidence and wishful thinking. But slowness can also act like a filter that screens out the kinds of anomalies that don't fit cleanly into existing frameworks. Not because the anomalies are false, but because they are costly to integrate. To integrate an anomaly, you may need to revise textbooks. You may need to confront earlier biases. You may need to admit that a popular story was oversimplified. You may need to change exhibit labels. You may need to fund new research. You may need to share credit. You may need to endure ridicule until the evidence becomes undeniable. And so often, the easier choice is to wait. Waiting can be responsible. Waiting can also be a kind of quiet burial. This is where the word cover-up becomes both too strong and not strong enough. Too strong because it suggests a coordinated plot with a single intention. Not strong enough because it fails to capture how power operates through routine, through funding decisions, through career incentives, through the prestige hierarchy of journals and institutions, through the quiet discouragement that tells a young researcher, don't stake your future on that. Cover-up can be a drawer that closes gently, not a vault that slams shut. Now, take a step back and look at the emotional landscape that fuels these stories. Why do so many people believe history is being hidden? Because they sense, correctly, that history is curated. Every museum is a narrative. Every textbook is an argument. Every timeline is a choice about where to begin and what to leave out. You cannot tell everything. You must edit. You must simplify. The question is not whether curation exists. The question is who controls it and whether the public is allowed to see the seams. When the seams show, trust breaks. And when trust breaks, people reach for explanations that match their feeling. Sometimes those explanations are fair critiques of institutional power. Sometimes they become fantasies that turn uncertainty into accusation. So where is the honest middle ground? It begins with acknowledging that archaeology, like every human endeavor, is imperfect. It has been shaped by colonialism, nationalism, racism, class, and the politics of prestige. It has also been shaped by breathtaking devotion, scientists spending years on a single trench, conservators rescuing fragile textiles, local communities protecting heritage at great personal risk. Both are true. And if both are true, then the path forward isn't cynicism. It's transparency. Open archives when possible. Digitize collections. Invite independent verification. Support local stewardship. Admit uncertainty without fear. Teach the public how evidence is weighed, how mistakes are corrected, how knowledge evolves. Because the most dangerous cover-up is not hiding an artifact. It is hiding the process. When the public doesn't understand how science changes its mind, every revision looks like manipulation. Every correction looks like deception. Every cautious "we don't know yet" sounds like evasion. But "we don't know yet" is often the most honest sentence a human being can say about the past. So as we approach the end of this journey, we hold all the stories together. The canyon rumor, the jar that might be a battery, the stones in the highlands, the desert lines, the submerged shapes, the whisper of missing texts, the jungle cities revealed by lasers. Not as proof of a single, hidden master narrative, but as evidence that the past is vast, complicated, and often too human to fit into a clean myth. And we end with a question that turns inward. If we want truth, are we willing to accept it when it's untidy? And if we want institutions to be transparent, are we willing to be patient with uncertainty without turning every unanswered question into a reason to stop trusting reality itself? In the end, the past does not feel like a solved puzzle. It feels like a room at dusk. Shapes are visible, but softened. The corners hold shadows. You can move through it, touch what's near, but the far side remains indistinct. And if you bring a light, you reveal one part of the room while casting new darkness elsewhere. That's not failure. That's the nature of knowing. Across these chapters, we've walked through places and objects that have become magnets for suspicion and wonder. A canyon said to hide a carved citadel, a jar that might have held electricity, stone blocks fitted with astonishing precision, sealed desert chambers that invite rumors, maps that tease lost geography, crystal skulls that blur truth and desire, lines in the desert meant for the sky, shapes under the sea that challenge our timelines, bodies in the ice carrying intimate evidence, elusive texts that hover between archive and legend, and jungles that reveal cities only when technology learns how to see. Each story carried the same heartbeat: mystery, revelation, reflection, human insight. And what emerged was not a single secret, but a portrait of how human beings handle uncertainty. We are a species that cannot stand a blank space on the map, literal or metaphorical. We fill it with dragons, then with trade routes, then with data. We fill it with myths, then with theories. We fill it with whatever makes us feel less lost. That impulse is not foolish. It's how we survive. It's how we turn chaos into meaning. But it can also become a trap, especially when meaning hardens into certainty before evidence deserves it. The word cover-up carries heat because it assumes intention. It assumes someone, somewhere, is choosing to keep you from the truth. Sometimes there is intention. Power does shape narratives. Institutions do protect themselves. Governments do manage heritage for political and economic ends. Markets do distort authenticity. Careers do influence what gets studied and what gets ignored. These are not fantasies. They are ordinary human behaviors amplified by authority. But sometimes the cover-up is not a plot at all. Sometimes it is delay. Sometimes it is bureaucracy. Sometimes it is a well-meaning desire to protect fragile sites from looters and crowds. Sometimes it is the slow conservatism of science, which asks for replication and context before it rewrites a story. Sometimes it is simply the fact that history is too big to fit in our museums and our minds at once. The danger is when we reduce all complexity to a single moral drama, the brave truth seeker versus the corrupt gatekeeper. That story is emotionally satisfying, but it's often too simple, to be honest. The real world is usually messier, filled with people doing their best inside systems that reward caution and punish risk. And yet, if we accept that mess, we are not condemned to ignorance. We are invited into a different relationship with knowledge, one that is more adult, more resilient, more humane. It begins with understanding that the past is not a trophy to be owned. It is a shared inheritance, and it comes with responsibility. Respect for local communities whose ancestors built the ruins we admire. Respect for conservation, because discovery without preservation is just another form of theft. Respect for method, because wonder without rigor is easily exploited. And respect for uncertainty, because pretending we know more than we do is how myths become chains. If we want a future in which hidden histories are less likely to be hidden, whether by malice or by neglect, we need transparency. We need open data when it is safe to share. We need digitized collections, accessible archives, and public education that teaches not only conclusions, but processes. How dating works, how peer review works, how mistakes are corrected, how debates evolve. Because the most humanistic insight of all might be this: truth is not merely something to uncover. Truth is something we build together, carefully, with humility across time. And that brings us back to the question that opened this journey. In that imagined museum basement, with its shelves disappearing into shadow, who owns the past? Perhaps the better question is, who is responsible for it? We are, not only the archaeologists and curators, not only the governments and institutions, but all of us, every listener who consumes a story about history. We have a choice. We can demand spectacle and certainty, which encourages sensationalism and secrecy. Or we can demand honesty and patience, which encourages transparency and care. The past will always contain mysteries. Some will be solved. Some will remain unresolved, not because someone is hiding the answer, but because time has taken too much. And some mysteries will persist because we haven't yet asked the right questions. So let the last image be simple. A human hand, brushing dust from stone. A careful motion. A willingness to see what is there, not what we wish were there. And a final question offered not as a riddle, but as an invitation. If memory can be shaped by power, by fear, by hope, what kind of memory will we choose to make of our own time? What will future hands uncover about us? And will they find that we treated truth as a weapon or as a shared, fragile light?